All right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name's Angela DeRosa from the New York Council on Problem Gambling and the Western New York Problem Gambling Resource Center. We're thrilled to have you here. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that the conference has been educational and informative for you all so far today. This workshop session is mindfulness for problem gamblers, and we're happy to have Dr. Rory Reed. Dr. Rory Reed holds a master's degree in social work and a doctorate degree in clinical psychology with a dual emphasis in neuropsychology and marriage and family therapy. He is an international certified gambling counselor, a research psychologist, and assistant professor of psychiatry at UCLA. And he is also licensed in Nevada and works with patients in Las Vegas who are seeking help for various disorders, including behavioral addictions, such as gambling and sex addiction. Additionally, he has published numerous research articles, and many of them have been featured in press outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, as well as a variety of television specials. So we are thrilled to have his expertise. I am a staff person, so I'll be here for the entire workshop session. If you need anything, please feel free as we're moving along to type in your questions into the chat box. Dr. Reed will be looking through them as we move along and answer some of them along the way, but we will leave time at the end for question and answer, and I'll be recording any of the questions that he doesn't get to during the session. So without further ado, Dr. Reed.
Hi, everyone. Guess what? It is a bones day today. I just verified that. It's not a no bones day, it's a bones day. So we can all be excited about that. I'm going to try to be kind to Tiffany, our interpreter, but I do speak fast. The good news about this particular presentation is there's a YouTube version of this that is on our UCLA Gambling Studies website, and I'll give that to everybody at the end so that you'll have access to that. By way of disclosures, I don't have any conflicts of interest with this particular presentation. So what is mindfulness? At this point in time, I suspect the vast majority of people have been exposed to mindfulness. We're aware of mindfulness. Most of the conferences these days have various presentations on mindfulness. So I'm going to this is not your first rodeo. I do have double monitors here. This is my house actually in Las Vegas, and people always ask me if that's a real background, and it is. I built that bookshelf. I like woodwork all the way to the top. So just to answer that question, it seems to come up a lot. So let's talk about mindfulness. I always, and what I want to do today is I want to present mindfulness as though you were my patients rather than colleagues, so that you can get some ideas about how to present mindfulness to your problem gambling patients, right? Because part of this is a sales pitch to some of our patients who they kind of don't really, the idea of mindfulness doesn't really resonate with them. And so I want to be able to share some ideas in terms of how I talk about it with patients to give you an idea of the same. I do have dual monitors, so I've got my entire chat box here and this one monitor, so feel free to put questions in there. I'll pay attention to that episodically throughout my presentation. So one of the things I talk about when I start, and I have a big screen in my monitor in my my office at the clinic, and I'll share some of these things with patients in my office or through Zoom. I start and say, all right, I want you to find the hidden tiger in this picture. And I show them this picture. And they'll say, well, I think it's over in the bushes. I think it's over in the trees. And you may yourself be looking for the hidden tiger. And really, the hidden tiger is, it's in the stripes. Do you see THEHIDDEN, TIGER down the back of the leg? So some of you are like, yeah, that was difficult to find. I think the vast majority of people actually struggle to find it. And you can Google this image and just the hidden tiger and you can find it. The point that I make out for my patients is that, like, mindfulness is like the hidden tiger. There are some things that are kind of right in front of us, but we're not seeing them. And I ask them and I invite them as we take this journey through mindfulness to kind of look for the hidden tigers that might arise throughout the process. And as we continue therapy, a lot of patients will say, "Oh, I found a hidden tiger today in my mindfulness practice," and they'll talk about that. So mindfulness, as we talked about before, there's been a lot of hype on it. It's a philosophy on the one hand, but it's also a practice on the other hand. And I think that's important. And, we can talk about the history of John Kabat-Zinn at General Massachusetts Hospital and how he worked with pain patients, and then it evolved. And now there's, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles in the research literature about mindfulness. A number of also studies have been done with gamblers, including some of the ones that we've done at UCLA. Bottom line is, this absolutely unequivocally should be something in your toolbox when working with problem gamblers. At this point, I would argue it is an evidence-based intervention with problem gamblers. So there's two parts to mindfulness. And one of the things I'll often start off with problem gamblers is kind of helping them understand these two parts. One aspect of this is learning how to regulate your attention. And the other is kind of the attitude in which you regulate your attention. One of openness, one of curiosity and acceptance, right? And part of the reason, if mindfulness did nothing more than just help people regulate attention, it would be worth its weight in gold. Because frankly, I'm going to show you later how one way to characterize a gambling problem is to characterize it as having an attention problem. We'll talk about that. So again, whenever patients, like for the first few 2 or 3, 4 sessions when I'm working with them, I'm like, okay, what does mindfulness do? What's the function of mindfulness? What is it we're trying to accomplish? Oh, regulating my attention and helping me with my attitude in terms of how I approach the things that I focus on, right? So that's kind of what we're doing here. And just like with anything, if I said, oh, I want to get better strength in my biceps, and you told me to go work out on the gym, and after a week you were just like, I don't notice anything, we would kind of laugh about that. We'd be like, give me a break, you've only been working out for a week. Like, come back in 90 days, and after 3 months, you're going to feel a little bit something different. I tell patients the same thing. Hey, you're trying to strengthen your muscles, stretch them, strain them, and that's how you're going to make them stronger, right? So we talk about that. And I talk about how when they're trying to focus their attention, that's going to cause them a little bit of mental stress. Just like working out at the gym is going to stress your muscles, strain them, stretch them. That's going to strengthen them. So help them understand that and encourage them to believe in themselves, and search for those hidden tigers that will evolve in their mindfulness practice. A common problem. You'll ask patients about their mindfulness practice and how that's working out, and they'll start talking about meditation. It's very important to differentiate that meditation does not constitute mindfulness any more than religiosity constitutes spirituality. Like, religiosity might be the conduit through which I cultivate spirituality, just like meditation is kind of the vehicle through which I cultivate a mindfulness state, right? And I'll use the analogy of like a car, if you were going on a road trip, and you're in your vehicle, in your car, and you came back and like, oh my goodness, how was your road trip? Oh, I was just in the car the entire time. It's like, you just missed the point, right? It's kind of like, the car is the vehicle to cultivate mindfulness. But when we think about the road trip, it's about the experience of all of the wonderful things that happen as we are in the vehicle driving and traveling. And that's kind of the analogy that I use. So I don't focus on the meditation. I do, to the point where they're able to do it efficiently. But I'm more focused on the mindfulness experience, right? So make sure, and my admonition would be to acknowledge that with patients so they don't get caught up in just focusing on meditation. They always keep in mind that the goal is cultivating a mindfulness state. Patients early on are going to struggle. And one of the things they're going to struggle with is, what the hell does this have to do with my gambling problem, right? And remember that little scene in Karate Kid where Mr. Miyagi and Daniel-san is like, why do you have me do this wax on and wax off? And this is the moment where he starts to realize that like all this wax on and wax off stuff that he's been doing in the wrecking lot of the car yard, how it generalizes to mindfulness. I'm going to try to just play this. How it goes.
Sand floor. Big sucker. Sand floor.
Through.
Sand floor. Now show me wax on, wax off. Hey.
Wax on, wax off.
Wax on, wax off. Hey, wax on, hot. Wax off. Hot. Concentrate. Look at my eye. Lock a hand. Thumb inside. Wax on, hot. Wax off, hot. Wax on, hot. Wax off, hot. Wax on. Wax off. Show me pentafence. Up, down. Up, down. Up, down. Other side. Look.
Learn to code.
Look. Show me penthouse. Side. Lock wrist. Side. Show me wax on, wax off. That! Show me pentafence. Face! That! Show me side to side. That!
All right, that's enough of that video, right? Everybody, I hope that's a blast from the past for a lot of you. We remember that moment where Daniel-san realizes how all of this stuff that he didn't understand, how it related to karate, how all of it related to karate. And I'll share this video with patients and say, all right, you're going to have this little moment where you're going to start to realize how these principles generalize. But for right now, a little bit of faith, a little bit of trust. I need you to keep practicing. Okay. Let me go to the next slide on that. There's a lot of ways that problem gambling generalizes to mindfulness. I'm not going to sit here and read my slides. You guys can do that. We all hate it when the presenter just reads the slides. It's like, why is the presenter here? I can read the slides on my own. But you can see on the left-hand column, I've got all of these particular characteristics and things that are often associated with problem gambling. And in mindfulness, there are these antidotes, if you will, to mindfulness that allow people, for example, stress. I mean, there's mindfulness-based stress reduction is about reducing stress and letting go of the stories that give rise to stressful experiences. And again, rumination is often common with problem gamblers as opposed to reflection, right? With mindfulness. And again, let me do this right now too. There's an entire YouTube video of this presentation, and I think they're recording it here as well. I'm going to put the YouTube video on the UCLA Gambling Studies website, just in case we maybe run out of time today, but I go into some of this a little bit more in detail if you're wanting to get that. But the point here is to kind of go through a list like this and help patients recognize how mindfulness can be so beneficial across a whole constellation of problems that they're struggling with. So let's talk about the mechanisms of action. I know this might feel like a little bit of a lecture from graduate school, mechanisms of action, but I don't think we talk about this enough as therapists in terms of what is it in a particular modality, in a particular intervention, how does it exert its effect, right? And by the way, if you guys have any questions, feel free to text them in the chat box or comments as we go along. I'm kind of paying attention to that as well. So the first thing that mindfulness, how it exerts its effects, is it helps people increase their tolerance for uncomfortable feelings. And part of that is by helping them not judge those feelings, shame or whatever feeling arises. Like in a cognitive behavioral therapy, we're going to help challenge the irrational cognitions that give rise to that emotion. Mindfulness, we're just helping them pay attention to the bodily felt sensations that arise with that emotion. Now, that being said, there are things like the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, right? And that's where it kind of blends the two. But in just mindfulness alone, all we're helping them do is kind of pay attention, be open, that this feeling is neither good nor bad. I don't have to make up a story about it. I can just be present with it, right? So that's part of it. Stress coping, again, think about stress. Stress is the perception that my demands exceed the resources that I have, right? That's essentially what gives rise to stress. But that appraisal in and of itself is a process. It's a cognitive process of making up a story. It's evaluating and appraising all of my resources versus all of my demands, which, by the way, patients do a terrible job of. They often don't identify resources that they have within themselves, such as perseverance, right? Have you ever thought about a patient who's like, see, I just keep failing, I keep failing? Reframe that. Like, no, you keep persevering and keep persevering, right? This is wonderful. But at any rate, so, the mindfulness stress and the breathing that we do in mindfulness can often help reduce stress as well. We're reorganizing the relationships with cravings, being curious about cravings, not really seeing cravings as the enemy, right? We're also helping them learn how to regulate their attention and letting go of all the distraction thoughts and refocusing attention again and again and again. We'll come back to that. And then reducing impulsivity. And we'll talk about how mindfulness does that. There's a number of studies now that show compelling evidence that it's helpful in doing this. And what do we know about all of these mechanisms of action? Well, the correlations between mindfulness and erosion and all of these variables that I've just mentioned in the research again and again and again show efficacy, that these things actually do what they say that they do in terms of those mechanisms. This is a study we did on mindfulness with patients with gambling disorders. And again, find that mindfulness was inversely correlated with gambling severity, positively linked to emotional regulation, stress proneness, and all the rest of that. So in other words, inversely linked to emotional dysregulation, stress proneness, and impulsivity, right? So we know that enhancing people's emotional regulation, mindfulness, helps in turn enhance these other things, which then indirectly kind of reduce problem gambling. So let's talk about this first one, increasing tolerance for uncomfortable feelings. If you think about feelings in terms of a spectrum, on the one hand, and we do this, we dichotomize emotions, all good, all bad, but there's this arbitrary line that's somehow in the middle, and problem gamblers often assume if I somehow can kind of just disconnect from this one end of the spectrum, which gambling does, because anything that activates and acts on dopaminergic receptors, right, is going to help them disconnect and disassociate from things. But the problem is this arbitrary line somehow shifts. And so what they do is they end up ultimately reducing the bandwidth by they're not feeling these uncomfortable feelings, but they're also reducing the extent to which they can feel positive emotions. And that's why we sometimes see this alexithymia or this emotional numbness, if you will, about the things that they're experiencing. So what I tell patients is, look, thinking about that spectrum, one of the things we do in therapy is we're helping you go back into those uncomfortable, unpleasant experiences and learning how to be present with them, not judge them, notice how you feel, and so forth, by not making up a story about it, and helping them recognize that if you want to appreciate a sunny day, you've got to be able to live through a rainy day. And in fact, sometimes it's the rainy days that help us appreciate the sunny days, and vice versa. Of course, somebody could argue, well, sometimes it's about helping them learn how to dance in the rain. And I wouldn't dispute that either, right? Like there's a part of it where we've got to do that as well. So, we know, and we see this often, that, people, this vicious cycle, they feel depression, anxiety, shame, and then they go to their action tendencies to avoid or escape that. They go to the gambling, but then that creates further shame and depression, right? And so, what we've seen again in our research is that with mindfulness, we're reducing the emotional dysregulation, the stress, the impulsivity, and indirectly through mindfulness and these types of variables, we're reducing the problem gambling. And we've got a study that we've done that's kind of shown this as well. And interestingly, this also generalizes to sexual compulsive behavior or sex addiction as well. So stress coping. If you've ever thought about stress is kind of this circularity with stress, right? People have stress, they gamble, and then the consequences of their gambling lead to more stress, and it creates this circular downward spiral that can be incredibly difficult for them to escape. And so there are lots of different things that we can do with respect to stress coping with mindfulness. Some of this is kind of looking at the way we appraise things. And I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. This is a stress diathesis model. I suspect a lot of you have probably, been exposed to this. Also, the other thing, these various in the appraisal is what I was talking about earlier. People make up the thoughts, catastrophizing, jumping to conclusions. And in mindfulness, it's like, hey, a thought is just a thought. It's not a fact. Just because I think something doesn't make it true. There's that element of mindfulness where we're letting go. We just constantly let go. Now, I also do some things where, I have a whole other lecture on stress coping and problem gambling, and happy to give you access to that as well if you send me an email. But, there's some things like that they can do. There's a TED Talk and a few other things. In fact, I've got an entire 26-page workbook, a PDF. At the end of this, I'll give you my email address, and if you want that, I'm happy to give it to you and email it to you. It's something I created for UCLA. Reorganizing relationships with cravings. Okay, letting go of the thoughts about cravings, being present, and again, it is that element of it's that element of a lot of times people have a craving, and then they get excited or anxious about that craving. And the craving itself is neither good nor bad. They act out on the craving, and then there's the consequences. So the consequences are 2 steps removed from the craving. But the craving is just a physiological experience in the body, and helping them learn how to be present with that without making up a story, without judging it, and so forth, is part of how they reorganize that relationship with craving. This is an interesting, let's see if this will play. This is a little advertisement clip. Okay.
Whoa. Hello, Jonathan. It is I, your craving. It's like 3 in the morning. I wasn't expecting you. I could tell. Your place is a disaster. Well, it's funny you're here. I could really go for 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. Yeah, how did you... I'm your craving, Jonathan. Let us get a Big Mac at McDonald's. Don't worry, I DVR'd the game.
Crave as late as you want. Many McDonald's drive-thrus are now open 24 hours.
Now, were you guys able to hear that okay? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay. We kind of laugh and chuckle at that advertisement, but I'll often share that with patients to realize, and again, I'm not trying to pick on McDonald's. This could have been one of any of the food and beverage industry, but I try to normalize the idea that we've been conditioned in our society to give in to cravings, to act on cravings. that cute little radio announcement kind of demonstrates that, like, oh, 24 hours a day, go to McDonald's at 3 a.m. in the morning, we'll DVR the game. In the middle of the night when you should be sleeping, no, you should basically be having, a Big Mac meal and supersize it and all the rest of that, because that's what you crave and that's what you want. Meanwhile, there's more calories in that one meal than you should eat for an entire day, let alone eating it in the middle of the night when you should be sleeping. It's horrific. It's absolutely horrific what we're being exposed to in just general media. And I think it's important to let patients know that, and to talk about that, and even to talk about how that's very true in the gaming industry, how they market in similar ways as well. I love this study on appetite. What they found with mindfulness and the appetite was that acceptance, which is part of mindfulness, it reduces the extent to which participants experience a loss of control when exposed to food cues. This finding is not only practically relevant, but interestingly, from a theoretical point of view as well. After all, and this is the key, acceptance requires one not to control cravings, which paradoxically leads to higher levels of perceived control. And those of you that have had patients that have had sobriety for a while, and I sometimes will give talks to groups in recovery, and they will say, the moment I started to feel empowered was when I let go of the need to control the cravings, and I kind of surrendered, right? That need to control that. And there is that paradoxical thing, right? The moment you say, I'm just going to let go and I'm not going to try to control this, is the moment when you do feel empowered. Somebody reported that they're not able to see the slides. Yeah, I'm happy to email a PDF of these to people, provided that you just use them for yourself and you use them for your patients and you don't use them in any professional context. There's an entire talk that Dr. Hetty Kober gives on mindfulness and talking about urges and cravings. I think that's, let's see if we can play that one too. It comes up.
Mindfulness can be thought of as a non-judgmental attention to one's moment-to-moment experience, or kind of an accepting attitude towards whatever arises in the experience. And in the last 20 years, there's actually been quite a lot of research on mindfulness showing that it's effective for anything from stress through depression, anxiety, and chronic pain. In the last few years, some research was done that suggests that mindfulness training, or different forms of mindfulness training, are effective for substance use disorders, are effective for hypersexual behavior, and effective for pathological gambling. And one idea is that the reason why it's effective is because it teaches people a new way to interact with their craving, or a new way to interact with their compulsive urges. And one way that mindfulness training might do that is by teaching people to, first of all, notice when craving arises, kind of notice what's happening in the body, notice what it feels like, and just have the awareness to know that it's there, coupled with this feeling of acceptance. It's okay that the craving is here, without pushing it away, without wanting it to go away, just saying, oh, craving is here, and it's okay. And that's also often accompanied by a teaching that craving is kind of like all mental events. It comes and goes. It has kind of an ebb and flow of its own. And therefore, if a drug user, for example, can learn to recognize the craving, accept that it's there, and then notice as it maybe gets more and more intense, reaches its peak, and then goes away, perhaps even using a technique we call noting while that's happening. And it might be something as general as saying, oh, I'm feeling craving, I'm still feeling craving, or getting even more granular, more small in what you might notice. So for example, tightening in the stomach, oh, it's getting tighter, maybe tightening in the chest, sweaty palms, oh, okay, now it's relieving, and now it's falling away.
So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea about how, we kind of cope with cravings. So Daniel's asking, can we talk about the research that indicates that some people with mental health issues are having adverse effects to meditation? So there are a couple of things we have to be curious about. Sometimes people with traumatic brain injury or people who have problems with interoceptive awareness that's affected in the insula, the right insula, anterior insula in particular, they may have problems with mindfulness. Often people with trauma, because they've spent so much time disassociating from their painful internal experiences, there is work that's necessary for particular patients, but that's not to say that it can't be effective. In fact, I think mindfulness can actually help with interoceptive awareness problems and so forth, unless the insula is damaged through an actual trauma or lesion or stroke. Then you're right, mindfulness would be contraindicated. So very good point, Daniel. As with all of our interventions, there are sometimes a few populations for which the intervention may be contraindicated, or we need to kind of tread lightly. So the full TED Talk I'll have in my, oh, I've got a handout too on mindfulness that I can email everybody at the end. We'll work that out and get that to you as well. Okay, so this is what I talked about with consequences being 2 steps removed from craving. So helping patients get out of that tug of war with the craving, the tug of war that they often lose, and just telling them, like, it doesn't have to be a tug of war. Mindfulness is about letting go and letting go of the rope. Like, you don't have to be part of the tug of war, right? And in fact, we talk about patients having executive deficits in problem gambling. There are some studies that have shown that mindfulness actually recruits different parts of the brain that aren't even associated with executive functioning. So again, just making it an incredibly appropriate intervention for our patients. All right. One of the things that I talk about too is reorganizing the relationship with craving. The goal is to learn how to coexist with the craving. It's not about slaying the dragon, at least not with mindfulness, right? I'm not avoiding the craving, but I'm not indulging it. I'm just being present with it. Like, hey, the craving's here. It can coexist with me. I don't have to make up this story about the craving that I somehow have to slay the dragon and so forth. There's lots of studies investigating craving and mindfulness that have shown its efficacy. I'm not going to go into all of them, but they're just again and again. It seems like all the time, every time I open up PubMed, there's something else. Regulating attention. This is another mechanism of mindfulness. Have you ever thought about gambling as a problem with attention? I'm trying to focus on my work, but all of a sudden these thoughts are coming into my head, and hey, I can't get that out. But truthfully, if you think about this, in an attentive condition, I'm able to focus on my work and I'm able to inhibit thoughts of gambling. So there's 2 mechanisms, right? And this is all associated with the anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Sorry, Tiffany. I don't even know how you would translate those things in sign language, but those 2 particular parts of the brain are implicated in attention. And mindfulness, incidentally, strengthens those particular parts of the brain as well. But the idea here is I've got to sustain my attention and I've got to inhibit my attention, right? And those, incidentally, are 2 problems that are very common with adult ADHD. And by the way, we know that 25 to 28% of problem gamblers have adult ADHD. And there's been 162 studies that have showed efficacy for mindfulness with ADHD. So it's great. You can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, as it were. But if this is an attentive condition, this is the inattentive condition, right? Where they're not able to sustain attention on their work or whatever, and they're not able to inhibit their attention from gambling. It's kind of an interesting conceptualization of a gambling problem as an attention problem. And what did we say mindfulness is helping them do? Mindfulness is helping them learn how to regulate attention. So it's a very appropriately well-matched intervention, right? And the attention is focused on the immediate experience, not having it wander to, euphoric recall of the last time I gambled, and it's not anticipatory excitement about gambling. It's letting go of that and just really truly being present on the immediate experience. Okay. So what? Well, if this is all that mindfulness did, it would be amazing, right? In terms of helping people just regulate attention. But, and this, I've got to redo this slide somehow, but the point here is with mindfulness, right? The amount of mind wandering, including wandering to gambling thoughts, is reduced. I notice my mind wandering sooner. I let go of the wandering thoughts sooner, and I'm able to refocus my attention sooner. Collectively, then, I'm able to spend more time being present and less time with mind wandering and or being inattentive, right? That's the whole purpose of mindfulness and practicing again and again and again. So Dia asked the question, great question, thoughts about guided meditation. So some patients respond really well to the guided meditations, and we've got some of those. If you go to, and I'll put this in the text box, marc.ucla.edu. There you go. It's in the text box, the chat box. We've got a number of free guided meditations on our website. Some patients, though, those guided meditations actually become a distraction. And so I tell them, practice these, practice some where you're just focusing on your breathing, and I'll direct them in the nasal, the thoracic, or the belly. Like when you're trying to really focus on helping your attention, pick one of those three areas and stick with it, right? Notice are your breaths rapid or shallow, or rapid or slow, deep or shallow, the coolness or warmth of the air. Just kind of pay attention to that and focus on that. And they can do that independently, right? Independently of them, of a guided meditation. Some patients do better with a guided meditation, so let them practice with both. So some, there's not really an explanation about why one might work better than the other. All right, impulsivity. This is a great one to talk about with patients. We know that many problem gamblers struggle with impulsivity. And by the way, I always use the UPPSP because there's those 5 different types of impulsivity. And I think it's important to narrow down with a little bit of specificity about which particular types of impulsivity they may struggle with. And obviously, these are the 5 types of impulsivity associated that have all been linked, but negative urgency is the one that is pretty much the most common. And negative urgency is this, acting impulsively in the wake of an uncomfortable or unpleasant mood state. And I'm not going to go into all of these. Again, I'll give you the slides and you can look at those. And we found that clinical levels of impulsivity are common in gamblers, patients with hypersexual behavior or sex addiction, and meth abusers. Look at that. All about 50% of our problem gamblers struggle with impulsivity, and about 50% don't. So it's erroneous to assume that all problem gamblers are impulsive, but it is a common problem. This again kind of talks about mindfulness and how it can reduce impulsivity. It's an interesting study that came out, and it does so through mindfulness, right? Helping enhance self-control and impulsivity. Now, often people think about like, well, how does that happen? Now, this particular quote, okay, hypersexual behavior is sex addiction, Misty. Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Now, I know this quote has been attributed to Viktor Frankl and a number of other people. My research assistants spent a lot of time fact checking this. This is the accurate citation for the individual who made this quote, where this quote is origin. I love kind of digging down on those sorts of things. But anyway, the point is, this is a very powerful, and I actually have this quote in my office for my patients, right? To recognize that you have the stimulus, this craving or this thought, and the time that you actually decide to do something about it, there's a space. But many problem gamblers skip over that space, just going a million miles an hour. But in that space is where they make a choice, a conscious choice. And so we can slow things down, help them just be in that space for a moment. That is where they have the power to choose and respond more appropriately. And so this is one of the ways in which mindfulness helps attenuate impulsivity in our problem gamblers, right? So it helps slow down and give pause, right? And that space is where we want them to start to notice that space, be present with that space so they can make better choices and not be so impulsive. All right. So by summary, all of these particular things are ways in which mindfulness can be helpful. And these are the things that we need to educate our patients about, to say, look, these are the ways in which mindfulness, because they're going to try mindfulness and like, oh, I tried that, but they're going to get lazy. They're going to acquiesce. They're going to become complacent. And it's our job every session to help maybe spend a few minutes being mindful, talk about that experience. And people say, well, how often should I practice? So if you want to look at therapeutic effects of mindfulness, on average, when we see the large effect sizes in studies, it's about 20 minutes a day. So but meet the patient where they're at. For some of them, that might feel like a lot. So we've talked about the mindfulness process, and we've done neuroimaging studies on this, where we've looked at different parts of the brain being activated in mind wandering, then becoming aware, then refocusing your attention and so forth, right? So they first become aware of the mind wandering. Then they notice where the mind has wandered. Oh, that's a planning thought. That's an anxious thought. That's a judgmental thought. I think it's important for them to start to notice the patterns, and then letting go of the tangential thoughts, right? And that's something we don't talk about enough, like letting go again and again and again. Remember, Karate Kid, it's going to generalize. When they're sitting at work and they're having the thought like, oh, I want to go to the casino on my break, or I want to go gamble on my break. You know, oh, let go of that thought, but it keeps coming back. I know, let go. Well, it keeps coming back. I know, let go. You've done that in your mindfulness. Sometimes you let go 50 times, 100 times in 10 or 15 minutes. You've practiced letting go. And so when they actually struggle with those thoughts, it's like, oh yeah, I got this. I'm used to practicing letting go. It's something I do on a regular basis, right? So be aware of that. And then refocusing the attention, right, on the present moment. Now, the spirit of mindfulness, and again, these are a couple of clips that I'm going to, for the sake of time, going to skip, but I talk about this scene where he's completely out of control with his hallucinations, and then that moment are present. And again, let me do that right now. I'm going to give you this video link. Here is this presentation. This is what, and you're welcome to share this. That right there is the YouTube link I give my patients, and I have them watch kind of this discussion about mindfulness that I did. And it's this particular link I gave.
Is that A Beautiful Mind?
Yes, this is from A Beautiful Mind. That video is the YouTube link that I just sent you, along with the others from this presentation. This is, if you want to give this YouTube video, you can let your patients watch it and then talk about it. Because in the video, I talk about all of the principles that we've been talking about today, right? So here's the UCLA mindfulness website. Also, there's a link for this mindfulness and gambling addictions, an article that I did on Pro Talk. And then, you know, several books that I think are helpful for patients. Some of them might do a little bit better than others. And again, I don't have any conflict of interest or any relationship with any of these authors. But again, this also is a list of things that I think might be helpful. My email address is just roryreed@ucla.edu. Let me put that in the chat box. So there's my email. Feel free to email me. And also, I know you're doing evaluations for this presentation through the New York site. We've just got like a little 5-answer feedback survey if you want to give us through UCLA, that I've sent the link for that. I'd appreciate that. That helps me with my tenure and all the rest of that at UCLA. So now I want to kind of just open this up to questions. And by the way, if you complete that survey, fire me off an email, and I will email you the handout that I have for mindfulness. And I'll also email you that stress coping workbook for free. Those are little gifts if you'll be so kind. And it's just going to be on the honor system. If you tell me you filled out the little 5-item or whatever a survey for UCLA, I'll be happy to email that to you. All right, so questions. We do mindfulness each week for 120 minutes. Also, They've given you a website, offers meditations daily, except on Sunday. All welcome. Thanks for that invitation, Daniel. So there's another resource. And again, there's a plethora of resources out there, as many of you know. Other questions on mindfulness? And again, you can put them in the chat box. Somebody asked my email. It is Rory Reed, RORYREID @ucl.edu. And then again, I put the link for that little survey that we have. And this is separate from New York. They still want you to do the New York evaluation one. This one kind of helps out with my with just tenure and all of that at UCLA. And there's my contact information. And again, I realize at this point in time, a lot of us have been to conferences where we've been exposed to various concepts of mindfulness and so forth. My experience with patients is they really struggle. We've got to stay the course with them. I think sometimes helping them understand, how mindfulness is going to be helpful, how it generalizes to their gambling problem and struggles. Those are all things that I think are incredibly helpful, because a lot of my patients do kind of initially resist it, or oh, I didn't have time, and yada yada, all the excuses that they give us. And I'll just focus on that and say, hey, this is, all right. A couple of questions. Let's see. What was the mindfulness process after being aware of mind wandering? So, being aware of mind wandering. So this is kind of the moments when your thoughts actually wander from whatever it is you're supposed to be focusing on. So for example, my breathing. Okay. Then you notice where the mind has wandered, right? And this is kind of the practice of noting that Dr. Hetty Kober talked about. Oh, is that a planning thought? Is that an anxious thought? Is that a judging thought? Just noting, right? And sometimes they'll start to make up stories. Oh, you know what? I'm not doing this mindfulness properly. I must be doing, that's a judgmental thought. So just having them note that and then letting go. Part of what they're letting go of is all of the sticky stories, right? All of the sticky stories that they make up. I have a client that will often ask, how do you let go? How would you describe what's actually happening when we let go? What techniques do you use for guiding people to actually let go? So here's the thing. That's a great question, Jeffrey, because a lot of times they're letting go. What they're letting go of is the sticky stories. And these are stories they've often had throughout their entire life, right? It could be, it's the wandering thought. It's the judgmental thought. It's the planning thought. It's whatever thoughts, because they have an experience and then they make up a thought about that experience. And it's the thoughts that we're trying to get them to let go of. And how do they do that? They practice again and again and again. And part of the process of being mindful is just noting that their mind has wandered. It's noting the types of thoughts that come up when they try to be present, that are distracting them from being present, and letting them go. But it is an incredibly hard thing for them to do. And I always say, well, that's really hard. It's like, yeah, that's why we practice, right? I mean, that's why we practice. So what are your thoughts on Tai Chi as a part of mindfulness? Yeah, good question. I don't think it's necessarily contraindicated, but it doesn't in and of itself constitute the mindfulness approach, right? So it could be complementary. Okay. How about when mindfulness is interrupted by obsessive thinking? Yeah, great question. Obsessive thinking is kind of that when people have that rumination or that false alarm that goes off in their head. And that's where it's like a thought is just a thought. It's not a fact. Just because I think something doesn't make it true. It's recognizing, and OCD is kind of a different, I mean, we could talk about that. That really requires an entire separate lecture. But it's recognizing that that thought is a false alarm, letting go and refocusing on the bodily felt sensations. Like, what do you notice? Tightening of the chest, the abdomen, increased respiration. It's bodily felt, somatic kinds of things. What am I noticing? Being present in this moment. But but yeah, the people with true OCD, that's, again, mindfulness has been shown to be effective with that population, but there are a few little anomalies that we kind of adjust when working with that population. Somebody asked me, can you provide a link, article, YouTube that shows connection between ADHD and problem gambling? Yeah, Paul, I could show you that. The problem is it's going to be PubMed, and you're not going to have access to that if you're not in academia. So Paula, if you email me directly, I'll send you a study that I just did last year that talks about ADHD and problem gambling. So again, you've got my email. I'll type it again here in the box, Paula, and anybody else. So I've told my research assistant to be aware that I'm going to get a gazillion emails today. So feel free to flood my inbox and just let me know what you want. Headspace app, great app. Headspace app, Calm app. And again, if you complete that little survey that I asked you to do and send me an email, we'll send you these goodies. We'll send you the and there's the link again for this. This is a separate survey from New York Council, just to be clear, just for UCLA. I'll send you my mindfulness handout that I have and the stress workbook, but Headspace is one of the apps that we recommend. Calm is another good app. And I think those are absolutely good apps. But back to the previous comment, some people, right? Some people don't like guided meditations, and it's better for them just to do it on their own. But absolutely, I think the Headspace app is absolutely a great app to help with mindfulness. What about creating art as mindfulness? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Benjamin. Maybe you could clarify. Yeah, so, all right. Any specific suggestions on letting go? Focus on the body. Well, again, with letting go, you let go and then you refocus your attention to whatever the target is. Whatever your anchor is your anchor your breath? And where are you focusing on your breath? Or a feeling, like focusing, again, when you let go of the mind wandering, you refocus your attention, right? It's refocusing your attention on the present moment. All right, so they're going to send out a post from the New York folks, so that's great. Benjamin, he says, I don't even know what I mean. Okay, Benjamin, kudos to you. That's great. Do you teach clients to cue mechanisms like using a tone or a bell, also a primer on mindfulness? Yeah, you can do that. Or sometimes, yeah, like some of them do timers that have all of that. That's ancillary. You know, I think the most important thing is that, like, they're the practice, getting them to practice. Those are all little things that may enhance the experience, but aren't necessary for the experience to happen. So just a little FYI on that. So other questions, comments? It's a Bones Day, you guys. It's a Bones Day. And if you don't know what that is, you need to get on TikTok or ask your patients. They'll know what a Bones Day is. So it's a Bones Day today. Things are going to be great. All right. I'm going to turn the time, if there's no other questions, I am going to turn the time back over to Angela with the New York Council on Problem Gambling.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this session.